Good afternoon to all. Our participants here and as well online. And today I'm pleased to welcome Ukrainian Catholic University, the American historian, Jared Воррен, in particular at the seminar on intellectual history led by Professor Alexander Zaitsev, Center Professor Alexander Zaitsev. And this seminar is coordinated together with the Ігоря Скочиляса Center for Religious Culture and Kievan Christianity Research Program. Джаред Воррен is visiting Lviv as a guest researcher at the Center for Urban History, and I'm very thankful for you that you found the time to visit UKU and present your research here. And I'm very happy to see students at this lecture as well, and our PhD student also. A few words about today's speaker. Джаред Воррен studied history, Eastern European studies and French literature in Michigan, Kansas and Krakow. He received his PhD from New York University in 2021 with a thesis on multi-confessionalism and Polish independence in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century. After his doctorate, he worked as a Max Weber postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy. After that, as a research assistant in the Department of Eastern and Southeastern European History at Ludwig University in Munich, in Germany. And now he is a researcher at the Ляйбніца Institute of European History in Mainz, also in Germany. Together with Tomasz Konarski, Jared has been organizing the online initiative as a money seminar for Eastern Catholic history since 2022, and it is an honor also to be the Ukrainian Catholic University a part of this seminar. Actually, Ігоря Скочиляса Center for Religious Culture for the second year. We also organizers of this seminar.
Third year.
Second.
No, second. It's the fourth year. We've just started our fourth year, and I thought it's
Also,
we're grateful.
also a few words about his research interests. Actually, modern and contemporary history of East Central Europe, multi-confessional societies, Catholicism, and the Eastern Catholic churches. So, after this short presentation of our today's speaker, I would like to remind you that today's seminar time schedule, between 40 and 50 minutes for your presentation. After that, up to 15 minutes for the panelists to speak. Actually, Dr. Yuri Zuzulak is our today's discussant. And finally, up to 30 minutes for questions and general discussion. Now the floor is yours. And the last comment from my side, you can also ask questions not only in English but in Polish as well. Jared knew German, Polish, English, and French. So in 4 languages, the language that we ask in this language. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivan, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight, both everyone here in the room at UKU and everyone online. It's a real honor for me to be here. I'm really pleased that this worked out, so I'm really grateful again to Ivan for the organization, and I'm grateful to Dr. Ігор Скочиляса for reading a draft of my presentation for today, preparing comments, and look forward to the discussion. So,
recording in progress.
Good. So, when I start talking about the fact abroad that I'm interested in the religious history of Poland, the responses that I always get are, oh, you know, Poles, they're so Catholic, the great Polish Catholic tradition, John Paul II. And this idea of the Polak Catholic, the Pole Catholic, is a very strong stereotype that we still have in our minds. But from a historical perspective, this historians have spent a lot of time trying to understand how it is that this link came about. And so historians like Brian Porter, an American historian.
I will turn.
Okay, so I'll say, we can go to the next slide already. Hopefully I remember what my slides are. So historians like Brian Porter, the American historian, has argued that this kind of relationship, the strong integration of Polish Catholicism and Polish national identity happened in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is arguments a similar time frame to what Michał Łuczewski, a Polish sociologist, has argued in a micro-history of the study of Ляйбніца, this village in today's south-central Poland. And this kind of idea of this emergence of a strong, deeply embedded national consciousness among the broader population is something that many Anglophone and German historians have taken up much more broadly beyond its kind of religious context. So these modern national consciences we can kind of think of as a more modern project. So but rather than thinking about why Polishness becomes so strong, or this role of Catholicism, I've been largely intrigued by a very different question, which is, in a sense, for my area of interest in the first half of the 19th century, this idea that Roman Catholicism will become so dominant, demographically dominant in the Polish lands, as it does after World War II, is not necessarily obvious. And this is not obvious for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the first half of the 19th century, Polishness is very associated with revolution. It's not just Kościuszko, we have the Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon, there's the November Uprising in 1830, there's 1846, 1848, 1863, and so there's a lot of revolution happening, and there's very little that the Catholic Church dislikes more in this period than revolution, right? So this is in the aftermath of the French Revolution. The Pope has condemned the November Uprising in 1830, and so this association of Polishness with revolution does implicitly mean that there's some kind of tension between Catholicism and a lot of Polish intellectuals, Polish revolutionaries. But there's also a second reason why I think this is an interesting problem to think about from an earlier period, which is that Polish intellectuals in the first half of the 19th century, when they imagined spatially what Poland is, we can go to the next slide. I think we can skip this. Yes, so when Poland is imagined, it's imagined on the boundaries of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or even prior. You can see here in this quotation that it goes all the way to the Oder River in today's kind of western Poland, on the border with Germany. And in this space of the former Commonwealth, only about 42% of the population was Roman Catholics, according to the statistics that these intellectuals had. So, on the one hand, we have this kind of multi-confessional situation that's taken relatively for granted. It's not that they believe that there's not differences, that there's not hierarchies, but when they imagine Poland, it's implicitly understood that if Poland comes back, because they claim the mantle of the entire Commonwealth, it's understood to be multi-confessional. So what I want to do in the rest of my time today is try to put these two ideas together. On the one hand, this idea of a strong sense of Polish Catholicism, and on the other hand, this tradition of multi-confessionality, of religious tolerance that also plays a strong role in the Polish imagination. And you have this kind of idea of tolerance and multi-confessionality as well, and in a scholarly form written in, say, like Janusz Tazbierz, Państwo bez Stosów, but also when I was living in Warsaw doing research for my PhD, I had all kinds of conversations with Poles, Polish students, and even very conservative ones, and ones who are committed Roman Catholics, voted for peace, would still kind of celebrate this legacy of tolerance. So, well, kind of tolerance and multi-confessionality and a strong sense of Roman Catholicism are not necessarily contradictory concepts. They're not necessarily things that we would obviously put together. So this is what I want to think about in the rest of my presentation. And for now, I want to make a single point that I think in their modern form, this idea of the Polak Catholic, this kind of Polskość as Catholic, and this idea of kind of multi-confessional, tolerant Poland emerge in a similar milieu, in similar contexts, in collaboration and competition with each other. Okay, so I'm going to try to go back and forth a little bit between these two concepts. And so I hope it won't be too difficult to follow, but I'll try to make the transitions clear. So we have to kind of read back and forth. So these are statistics that I've taken from some early 19th century publications. So these are statistics about the makeup, the religious demographics of the Polish lands in this particular period. So again, these Polish intellectuals are kind of taking for granted that this imagined Poland is going to be multi-confessional. We can head to the next slide. Yes, so I wanted to start here with a rather perhaps unexpected place, which is with this Polish Jacobin, Józef Pawlikowski. So in this immediate aftermath of the partitions in the late 18th century, in the early 19th century, we still have in the Polish tradition kind of strong tradition of the Enlightenment. And in this kind of Enlightenment context, among the elite intellectuals, you don't really have strong confessional attachments. There's a kind of hierarchy where the churches are understood to be compatible with political institutions, that the political institutions can, to some extent, organize and reshape religious institutions for the public good. And so this Polish Jacobin, Józef Pawlikowski, he claims in 1800 in this pamphlet here that historically in Poland, nobody was persecuted for their manner of belief, that Poland, in contrast to the rest of Europe, all of the clergy were quote-unquote enlightened, and he uses this to claim that religious fanaticism and violence are disappearing, that Poles are creating various gods to justify killing each other. And so in his understanding, this kind of confessional politics is minimized, and confessional commitments are kind of ranked below politics. And so you can kind of see a clear hierarchy, but also at the same time, I think there's a very strong sense in which these more enlightened style intellectuals understand a compatibility in a way, that the churches in some way are viewed as a junior handmaiden of the state, that the state can organize. But you can see this not just in more radical individuals like a Jacobin, we can go to the next slide, but you can see it in many other contexts as well. And I'm going to make a lot of points relatively briefly. So I'll go back so we can have both of those together. Yeah, so another example I have from a very different context at the same time is an essay competition that was held at the Society of the Friends of Rome, Towarzystwo Przyjaciół Nauk in Warsaw in 1805. That they open a public call for essays asking for responses to study the impact of the Reformation on the state of politics in Poland and the progress in her national enlightenment. So already here, in the very framing of the question, you can see the sense that it's not can Protestants be Poles, but rather did Protestantism help the evolution of the Polish state? Did Protestantism or Reformation enable a flourishing of intellectual activity? And this is something that you can see as well in the manuscript essays that were submitted to this competition. We can move to the next slide. So I'll just give you one example. Again, I'm going to one more, I think. Yes. So I'll give again a lot of examples very briefly. I'm more than happy to talk about all of these in more depth. I'm happy to bring in other examples because I know I'm trying to make a kind of long narrative with relatively small examples. So I'll point here to Ignacy Potocki, who in the manuscript that he submits, and he is a reformer. He does work in the four-year scene, but he's not radical. So he's somewhat in the middle of the road. And you can see very clearly in the way that he treats the Reformation here, again, is not as something inherently positive or inherently negative, but it's something that is being shaped and can be good or bad. So he argues that initially it was very positive, that it leads to an increase in enlightenment, but then it could be transformed later into something dead or harmful. So the Reformation, in his interpretation, is something of a neutral fact that depends on state guidance in order for it to be led to a positive place. So Lutheran reforms would bring advantages, but in the wrong hands, it can be socially disruptive. So again, the point I'm trying to make here at the beginning is we have this relatively deconfessional world among the Polish intellectuals and intelligentsia in the early 19th century, where a kind of specific confessional or denominational commitments matter to a large degree less than the extent to which religious institution was compatible with more broader political or enlightenment goals. So then, now I want to kind of switch and think a little bit about how the Catholic Church responds to this situation. This is where the Ultramontanism, in my title of the presentation for today, comes into this story. So what is Ultramontanism? Ultramontanism takes its name from from kind of an Italian phrase, Ультрамонтанний, so over the mountains, where we have a reorientation of European Catholic churches away from an earlier modern tradition where the churches were to some extent organized locally within individual states, see a kind of alliance between the church and the state. But in the aftermath of revolution, of European cycles of revolution, the churches began to feel very threatened and began to try to reorient themselves towards Rome. And so there's this trend towards integration with Rome, a tendency to look more and more to Rome for inspiration, for guidance, for centralization. And you can see this in the way that over the course of the 19th century, the figure of the Pope becomes far more important within the organization of the Catholic Church than earlier. This is partially due to just expansion of new kinds of media and technology, where photographs, cards, images of the Pope circulate much more broadly. But so this is the kind of movement then that results in the First Vatican Council and the official declaration of the doctrine of papal infallibility. So this reorientation of the Catholic Church towards the Pope. Some historians have interpreted this Ultramontane movement as a kind of attempt to bring even more consistency and uniformity to the Catholic faithful through centralization, through standardization, through kind of bureaucratization. But this has profound implications then for the relationship between the church and state. Yes, so this is perfect. So we can come here to Lamine, who is not Polish, but he's profoundly important in the emergence of this Ultramontane movement. Starting in 1817, he publishes this book here, nonetheless, the Essay on a Difference in Matters of Religion, which sparks a kind of European-wide religious crisis of sorts. Continual volumes of this continue to emerge for the next 7 years. Within a year, the book had sold 13,000 copies. Within 2 years, it's been translated into Dutch, English, and German. Within a couple more years, it's translated into Spanish. So it's a book that has an immense audience all across Europe in many different languages. What is he doing in this book? This is a very explicit rejection of this kind of more rational understanding of Catholicism that is predicated and preached by more Enlightenment style figures, and instead an argument that, and this is a quote from Lamine, quote, "The mysteries of Christianity needed to be expressed in the language of the heart." So you have this kind of emotional turn towards Catholic thinking. It's a rejection, in a sense, of this rational or utilitarian understandings of religion that dominated in Enlightenment. So, because Lamine is arguing that religion is fundamental to the ordering of society, the next question is, which religion is best organized to do this? If it's Catholicism, if religion is so important, then indifference is impossible. And because religion is so important for the organization of society, then error is problematic. And here's another quote from Lamine. He writes, "To tolerate dogmatically one sole error is to commit to tolerate all." So you have this move then away from, again, this more Enlightenment style understanding where various churches can contribute to the public good, to this Catholic response to everybody really needs to be Catholic. Not just everybody needs to be Catholic in that tolerating error is a problem, but it inverts this kind of hierarchy between religion and politics a little bit. So religion should shape politics, not the other way around. It should be religious authorities that have the broad say. And so this will have profound implications for the way that Polish Ultramontane priests and intellectuals will talk about the relationship of multi-confessionality and tolerance, because you can see that these ideas are already beginning to be challenged. Go to the next slide. So one example of the way that this is being taken up in Poland is this sermon here, written by the priest, or given by the priest Stanisław Paczewski in Vilnius in Vilno in 1825. It's a sermon called Religious Indifference. It's clearly inspired by his reading of Lamine, and like Lamine, he argues that the faithful in the pews and subsequently the readers need to think about, quote, our duties regarding religion, and to take seriously the obligation to become well acquainted with her rules, her truths. So again, the political impulses here are shifting from this premise of ordering religion for the public good to this attempt to remake the public in the image of faith. And again, this will have profound ramifications for the future relationship of religion and politics, and it will again challenge this idea of tolerance and multi-confessionalism that many of the Polish elite take for granted. Go to the next slide. So what I want to do now, so it will take some time for this Ультрамонтанний movement to settle in and become prominent in a Polish context. So we're talking in the 1820s, but the Ультрамонtanins will slowly grow in the 1830s and the 1840s. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to think about, kind of on the other side of the story, the way that this idea of tolerance and multi-confessionality develops in this same period going into the 1830s. And again, I'm moving very, very quickly across time. So one of the places where these ideas of multi-confessionality, of tolerance come out most strongly is in history. Because there is no Poland, there is no independent Commonwealth. And so it's being studied and deployed in historical texts, looking at the ways that this happened in the past when Poland was independent. And you can also see it coming out, I think, in its clearest formulations, not exclusively, but in its clearest formulations in historical texts that are being written in West European languages. Because part of this argument about Poland being a multi-confessional place, part of this argument about Poland being so tolerant, is an attempt to try to convince West European powers to intervene on the behalf of Polish independence. Why? Because at the same time, the Russian Empire is being presented as profoundly intolerant, as autocratic, as this kind of evil, intolerant empire. And so if Poland can be presented as the more tolerant space, then this presents a kind of, in this political ideology of the 1830s, a counterweight, something that's seem to be much better. So one of the places you can see this quite clearly is in the work of Valerian Kaczynski. Valerian Kaczynski is a distant cousin of Zygmunt Kaczynski, but not from the same branch of the family. He's from a Lithuanian branch of the family that is Calvinist. And during the November uprising in 1830, he is sent as a diplomat to London. He's in London when the revolution is suppressed, and he remains there until the end of his life in, I think, 1855. And so you can see in these, he begins to write more and more texts about the Polish Reformation, about the history of the Reformation religion in the Polish lands, where you can see that he, in this quotation here found in some of his archival documents at Harvard, a very explicit formulation of the way that he's writing these works in order to address the people of Great Britain, I think. Yes, in behalf, that might enable me to address in English language the public of Great Britain on behalf of my native land, little of which is known to this country except its sufferings. So in these works, he's very open about the fact that he's a Protestant, but he's claiming that he never experienced any religious persecution, that he was tolerant, that people got along, that he was never mistreated because he was a Calvinist. And I don't want to go into detail into his works in the interest of time, but you can see here on the next slide that reviews of the work, next slide, or one more. Here we go. So there were reviews of his works that are explicitly treating them as demonstrating this peculiar feature in the religious history of Poland of religious tolerance, which is contrasted to Western Europe. I think I will skip the next example, which is, so Valerian Kaczynski is a more conservative figure. The next example, Janszyński, he's from a Frankist background, he's a socialist, so I was trying to get two different examples to think about the way that religious tolerance is being presented here. Janszyński, he's very much an advocate for the inclusion of Jews. He argues that Poland was most powerful when, quote, a variety of races and religions explains why Poland was so powerful under Kazimierz the Great and under Stephen Batory. So religious diversity, religious tolerance, religious multi-confessionality is one of the reasons why Poland was strong. So there's a great many examples which I'm happy to talk about in more detail later, those who are dedicated to the study of the Polish religious history, that are defending tolerance, that are defending a multi-confessional image, where it's possible for someone like Valerian Kaczynski to see himself both as a Pole and as a Calvinist, and it's largely understood to be okay. This is the kind of intellectual background against which many of these Ultramontane priests begin to agitate. The next, all right, we can stay right here. So, and this is a quotation from Ignacy Domenico, who was a friend of Mickiewicz. They studied together in Vilnius in the 1820s. But this idea of these intellectuals in the Wielka Emigracja, in the immigration in Western Europe, is this understanding that nobody's particularly religious. There's a lot of quotations we can talk about here. But in this context, in this perceived kind of unreligious milieu, there's a handful of people that begin embracing kind of ultramontane Catholicism. The most important here is, for my purposes, the next slide, Bogdan Jański, who studied economics at the University of Warsaw, is sent in 1829 to Western Europe to study economics. He's supposed to come back and work for the improvement of the country. So he's in France when the November uprising happens, and he never goes back. At this point in his and around 1829, 1830, in the early 1830s, he understands himself as a socialist, as a committed materialist, but through contact, especially with French ultramontanes, people like Montaigne, he experiences a real conversion, a reconversion to Catholicism, but it's a conversion to a specific kind of French ultramontane Catholicism, and where he insists that a real Catholic listens to the Pope. Again, it's this ultramontane idea of the Pope being incredibly central. And this is coming in a very specific Polish context where in the 1830s, Gregory XVI has issued Cum Primum, this encyclical which condemns the Polish uprising. So saying a good Pole listens to the Pope is to reject the ideology of revolution. In Paris, Bogdan Jański founds a small home, a lay brotherhood, which after his death in 1839 is officially recognized by Rome. It becomes what is the Congregation of the Resurrection, the Zmartwychwstańcy. And the Zmartwychwstańcy, the resurrectionists, become the kind of early movement of the Polish ultramontane Catholicism. But what's important here is that many of these early individuals who are associated with the Zmartwychwstańcy, people like Hieronim Kajszewicz, had earlier been a Powstaniec, he already participated in the revolution, he was a part of the Masonic Lodge. You have the young Ruthenian radical Piotr Semenenko, who was a member of the Polish Democratic Party. So many of these young priests who are coming into the resurrectionist order have this experience of revolution, kind of a more of a political radicalism about them. And they set themselves up as the opponents to these more leftist or heterodox individuals. And they become particularly vocal around the late 1830s, early 1840s with the emergence of Andrzej Tomiański and his mystical religious circle, the Circle of Divine Cause, which is what Mickiewicz, the Polish poet Mickiewicz, is relating to, that is advocating for this very strange, heterodox kind of religious orientation where Poland is going to rise on the third day and save the peoples of Europe from their sins and all of this. And there's a kind of strange correlation of Napoleon and Jesus. And so the resurrectionists obviously see this as a profound threat to the Catholic Church. And so it's in these tensions between these more heterodox individuals and then the ultramontanes that we can start seeing these crystallizing lines again between a kind of multi-confessional tolerant idea and understanding that Poles must be Catholic. So Kajszewicz, for example, in 1842, so at the height of Mickiewicz's lectures that he gives at the Collège de France, where he's expressing these mystical ideas, the resurrectionist priests, these ultramontane priests, began insisting that a real Catholic needs to be Pole. So Kajszewicz, this ultramontane priest, he says in a sermon, "Nie może być Polakiem, kto nie jest katolikiem." It is not possible for he who is not a Catholic to be a Pole. In a similar context, we can go back actually to the previous slide. You can then see on the other side Seweryn Goszczyński, who is a member of Tomiański's circle. He writes things in articles in his diaries that nie podobny się razem dobrym katolikiem i dobrym Polakiem. It's not possible at the same time to be a good Catholic and a good Pole. Because for him, being a good Pole means this embrace of this mystical ideology, it means an embrace of the entirety of the people, this multi-confessional heritage, it means revolution. And so rejecting this ideology, or accepting the ideology of the ultramontanes, is is quite, is a rejection of everything, all of the political beliefs that they stand for. So, as this kind of conflict wears on, one of the things that I begin to see is that these ultramontane priests began formulating much more clearly a Catholic theology of the nation, and began to try to articulate in terms that might be approachable or understandable to a kind of a committed nationalist. Because all of these people, these radicals that I'm talking about here on the other side of this story are much more politically radical, and committed to this idea of the nation. And so Kajszewicz then, he starts saying things, again, this ultramontane priest in his sermons, that this feeling, the feeling of national sentiment, is more alive in the Pole than in others. He argues that God created nations and therefore this is a national sentiment, but rather than saying that this can lead to revolution, he condemns revolution in very aggressive terms. He calls the events in 1848 across Europe as, quote, a couple of aimless demonstrations, that this leads to the usual sins, shedding blood unnecessarily, and instead says that Poles should wait patiently, that they should commit to the personal spiritual restoration. So you can kind of again see this ultramontane language where of the emotions and the individual faith, that, and then it's through this patience where the path then to independence lays through working for the kingdom of God on earth and waiting for Poland's resurrection, not going about committing revolutionary acts. So these different camps that I think are being articulated and defined very much in conversation with each other. And as these ideas develop, they become stronger and stronger and more clearly articulated. So what initially in these ultramontane texts, what I see is very much a kind of, first of all, you need to be Catholic. You need to work, be pious, be good, don't do revolution. But as these borders between these different camps, religious understandings, become sharper, there begins to be a clear articulation among the ultramontanes about the challenges or the potential pitfalls of religious tolerance. And you can begin seeing other religious confessions, so non-Catholic confessions, being treated as a religious threat to the Catholic Church. So one example, this is just a poem that is by a resurrectionist priest that is written against Valerian Kraszyński. So this Valerian is Protestantizing in London is very clearly Valerian Kraszyński, this Calvinist historian. But we can, so here's some citations from Kajszewicz that are articulating this idea of the nation. We can, one before this. Yes, so here I want to come back to the place where I get the quotation in my title. I forgot to put in the slide, I think, for Valery Velikovsky. Valery Velikovsky is not himself a priest, but he's affiliated very closely with the Zmartwychwstańcy, with the resurrectionists. He works with Mainz in Paris. He founds a kind of similar house to Jański's in Versailles. He then goes to Krakow and organizes a Catholic publishing house, all the time working very, very closely with the resurrectionists, and publishes a number of texts where he is trying to articulate a kind of more Catholic, conservative Catholic ideology of nationhood that is in opposition to revolution, but nonetheless is an embrace of the concept of the nation. And here he condemns things like barbarism, paganism, and Judaism, Żydowski. So here you can see the ways that these kind of non-Catholic confessions are being more clearly articulated as an enemy, or as a problem, that to be a good Pole is not simply being religiously pious or being Catholic, but the other groups are then increasingly being understood as a threat. So you can see this relatively, or in interesting ways, I think, in which they begin to talk about the Uniate Church, the Greek Catholic Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So this is a quotation from a little bit later on from the Przewodniczący, which is the major Ультрамонтанний magazine, newspaper, that is, it's published in Poznan, but it's very connected to the entire kind of Polish Ультрамонтанний and resurrectionist milieu, where this, you can see these Catholicism increasingly becoming seen as something inevitable in Polishness. So in here, for example, there's this increasing sense that Ruthenia, the Polish-Ukrainian, the Ukrainian tradition in the Commonwealth is dependent on Poland for its very existence. So while the author of this text gives a kind of agency to Ukrainians, there's a sense in which this means that they have to become Catholic. He writes that after Lublin, that because Ruthenians, Ukrainians in the Commonwealth had a certain degree of freedom, intellectual choice, there's the Union of Brest, then you have the Union of Lublin, and the Union of Brest is the direct working out of this. So again, after Lublin, there had to be Brest, as I put in the title of my talk today. And in this same text, you can see condemnations of certain kings in the Polish past for being too tolerant, which is something that I haven't really seen in earlier texts, that tolerance is considered a vice. So some of the arguments that have been made in trying to understand why this kind of Polish and Catholicism becomes so integrated, and Brian Porter in a book, When National Something Hates, he argues that it's a rejection of historical teleology, that once Poles kind of realize that Poland is inevitably coming back, they become more xenophobic, more aggressive. But what I think you actually, when I see looking at some of these earlier Catholic sources is that there's the kind of Ultramontane eschatological vision of universal Catholicism that is actually a very strong sense that everybody is going to be Catholic, that everybody has to be Catholic, and therefore tolerance has to be limited because, again, to quote Lamennais, where I began in the 1820s, to tolerate one sole error is to commit dogmatically to tolerating all. So I'm running, I think, out of time, so I want to start to bring this story to a close. So I know I've been moving very, very quickly, but so what sense can we make of this story? So what I've been trying to suggest is that over the course of this period of the first half of the 19th century, what we see is a strong sharpening of confessional boundaries. So there's a form of kind of confessionalization that I think is taking place among these churches. The German historian Olaf Blaschke has written in what's now a fairly old article, written in 2000, das 1900, zweites Confessionales Zeitalters of the 19th century, a second confessional age with a question mark. He argues, he's responding here to interpretations of the 19th century as an era of secularization. And what he wants to say is, no, the 19th century is actually profoundly religious, and you can see a kind of strengthening of confessional boundaries, of confessional commitments. He's drawing from the work in Germany on the early modern period about confessionalization with about social differentiation, social pressure, producing distinct religious confessions, and applying it to the 19th century. This argument has been somewhat criticized for various reasons, but I think when we're talking about these intellectuals here, talking about Ultramontane Catholics, this is something that I think is quite relevant, that I can see very clearly happening. There's a kind of denominationalization that is happening within religious faith. It's becoming more institutionally defined, where in this process in which the Catholic clergymen are increasingly perceiving Polish revolutionaries as a threat, condemning revolution, there's this small group of Ultramontane Catholics that begins to re-articulate a sense of patriotism that is defined in a very Catholic key in order to kind of offer an alternative. But what's important to me here is that they're doing this in conversation. They're responding directly to these individuals who are defending a multi-confessional and tolerant Poland. So again, these priests are condemning religious heterodoxy in the exact same moments that people like Severin Oszczyński are declaring that nie może być, nie podobno być na dobrym Polakiem, a dobrym katolikiem. So in a sense though, I think this multi-confessional understanding of Poland is the backdrop. It's something that comes a little bit first, and it's in response to this in the fights with the more heterodox counterpart that the Catholic priests are beginning to articulate a more normative understanding of a Polish national Catholicism. And one of the important things here, though, is that this isn't a kind of abstract debate that is happening very broadly, but it's something that's happening in a very particular milieu among former revolutionaries, often among people in the emigration, which also means that these are in many cases people who used to be friends. They're people who worked together, they're people who fought together, they're people who studied together, worked in France together, and then as they become committed to a more kind of radical or leftist understanding of a kind of multi-confessional Poland, or become more of an Ультрамонтанний Catholic. But so part of, I think, the intensity of these debates is due to the fact that these are actually personal or formally personal relationships. That Kashevich is condemning people that he used to probably go to the pub with. I don't know for sure, but it probably was. I think it was quite the case. So, in other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that this national Polish Catholicism and this idea of a kind of multi-confessional coexistence, both kind of cultural myths of sorts that emerge in the 19th century, are emerging as, at times, complementary political, historiographical, and religious myths that are being produced in tension, collaboration, or outright opposition with each other. Although I think we've tended to forget a little bit more of this multi-confessional commitment as something that Poles were, at one point, in theory, at least somehow committed to. So, to understand one side of this, though, the Polaka Poland, I think we can't forget the kind of multi-confessional and more arguments about Polish religious tolerance. So while I wouldn't go as far as Krystian Ostrowski, who claims in 1840 that associating Poland to Catholicism is a stupid execration, une exécration stupide, I think that when we put it in the context of this emerging Ultramontane Catholicism, claims like this begin to make a lot more sense. So this aggressive formulation then in insisting on the place of Catholicism in Polish public life is not, I think, because it's so obvious, but in a sense because in the moments it's being formulated in the early 19th century, this argument was at a certain moment relatively weak. So to kind of finally bring this to a conclusion, this idea of a Catholic Poland and these ideas of a multi-confessional tolerant Poland are emerging in conversation with each other. So, thank you.